And I think this is a significant thing for us to talk about beyond religious communities, as the notion of identity in politics, both domestically and internationally, moves beyond ethnicity. Not so long ago, when he talked about identity, we were talking about ethnicity. Now, in a world of identity politics that all of us live in, but certainly those of us in universities do, where there are departments associated with most identities you can imagine, that these identities, if they have a transnational form, can actually be used as sources of power in American politics. There's a very interesting literature on transnational activism, transnational advocacy networks. Some of you may be familiar with it. But if you think about identity in terms of gender, sexual preference, ethnicity, religion, as I always tell my students, the Eric Clapton fan club, he is God after all, that these types of things cross international borders, and the Americans in those communities can use their U.S. citizenship to advance the interests of those broader communities. And then third, and this, I'm being honest, is the one that interests me the most, is that the political style, for lack of a better word, or the approach to foreign policy making that these three communities take is a function of the structure, the transnational structure of the community itself, and most interesting to me, what they might call the charism of their founding. This book is, and Tom Rees might understand what I mean by this especially. This is obviously a mid or late career book for a political scientist to write. I've been working in this field for 30 years, and I've always said this is about politics. I'm interested in political structures and processes, particular, as Tom was talking about before, the structure of party coalitions in various places around the world. I'm interested in politics, and I'm using religion and this institution as a way of articulating that political relationship. Well, here, I don't care so much about that. I'm really interested in these communities.
We're taping.
Yes, well, that's okay. I have tenure. I'm really interested in these communities. And put it another way, it's the most religious book I've ever written, because I'm interested in how the people in these communities actually articulate their own identity, how they articulate the type of community they belong to. And I argue that these three communities differ enormously along that dimension, and that those differences are reflected quite obviously, unavoidably, in the way they engage in politics in this context. So now the three cases. The first case, both in the book and here, is the Society of Jesus, an organization that many of you are familiar with, the Jesuits. And this is a paradigmatic transnational institution, transnational community. The Jesuits in the United States, there are several thousand of them, are US citizens, and yet they are members of a powerful transnational community into which many of them entered at young age, through which they have been, as they will tell you, formed. As I say in the book here, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola are not only an actual kind of shared experience, which initiates a person into this organization and defines their spiritual life, but it's also kind of, and I mean no disrespect to this, a kind of a transnational secret handshake. They all have done this, and I have met many, many Jesuits in the process of writing this book, and I asked every one of them what was the glue that held the transnational community together, and they all gave me the same answer: the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. So this is a very strong transnational community that is truly transnational. I'll tell you another story when we compare it to the other groups. Jesuits are devoted, as you may know, to the concept of mobility, that they are supposed to be available to go anywhere that the church needs them, as founded in the Counter-Reformation. And I asked a Jesuit provincial, how this was lived today. And he said, oh, it's still very important. All of the Jesuits I work with are willing to go anywhere as long as it's on the west side of Manhattan. In 1989, a group of soldiers from the Salvadoran military broke into the University Central America in San Salvador, the UCA, roused 6 Jesuits from their sleep, took them out to a garden outside their residence, laid them all face down, and shot each one of them in the back of the head with a single bullet. I remember reading about this in the newspaper in November 1989 and being shocked that this would happen, A, and thought that this was problematic, given that the army that had shot these Jesuit priests was receiving $1.5 million a day from the US government. Well, I thought it was problematic, but the Jesuits in the United States thought it was absolutely outrageous. And so it was a near universal mobilization on the part of the Jesuits in the United States to express their outrage that their government, the US government, was engaged in killing or at least indirectly supporting those who had killed their brothers. This raises a kind of a tension within the identity community, if you want to call it that. And it's not that Jesuits in that context had to choose between being American citizens and Jesuits. It's the exact opposite, that actually the articulation of both of those identities was the very thing that gave them political influence that would be useful for the Jesuits who were under siege in El Salvador. So the Jesuits in the United States did many things. Your own Leo O'Donovan wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post the next morning. He also invited Adolfo Cristiani, who was the president of El Salvador, to his office here at Georgetown so that he could criticize him. And the only reason that he could do that is because, do you know why? You don't? Cristiani is a graduate of Georgetown University. Joe O'Hare, the president of Fordham, was asked by the provincial to give a speech at St. Ignatius Loyola Parish in New York, where he denounced this action and talked about the United States having blood on its hands, and very emotional appeal to the United States and not only Jesuits but other Catholics in the United States to denounce this action that had been supported by the US and the Salvadoran military. So there was a broad array of activities. Charlie Byrne from Santa Clara University and Dean Berkley from Fordham, Dean Berkley, who just died a couple of weeks ago in El Salvador, went down to El Salvador, as they said at the time, with the blood still on the walls, to take over leadership of the university. They also tried to raise money to keep the university open and separate and autonomous from the Salvadoran government. And the Jesuits in the United States mobilized what, of all people, Nancy Pelosi called the Jesuit family. And what she meant by that was the University of San Francisco happens to be in her district. And so if you go to the congressional record, as I did, there was a long, long list of congressmen and senators who talked about visits they had received, mostly and predominantly and prominently from the local college president. And finally, Donald Monin, the president of Boston College, actually went to El Salvador and sat in the courtroom for the sham of a trial where the Salvadoran government tried to pass off this crime on low-level officers in the army. The Jesuits in the US were joining with their brothers in El Salvador to do two things. One, to bring pressure on the Salvadoran government to identify and try what they call the intellectual authors of the crime, and even more importantly, to place pressure on the US government to thereby place pressure on the Salvadoran government. And the way they did that was by placing pressure on the US government to cut off funds to the Salvadoran military. Second case is Marinol missioners. I studied a group of women. There are Marinol men, but I chose to study the women. These are women who have devoted their entire lives to leaving the United States, they are US citizens, and going to, in this case, Nicaragua, to be with and, as they call it, accompany the people. When the Marinol Missionary Society was founded early in the 20th century, it was because the United States was just emerging from mission territory itself. The Vatican still considered the United States mission territory. This was considered an embarrassment. So a couple of priests founded this Catholic Missionary Association of the United States, and their role was very clear. They were going to baptize pagan girls in China. China did not yet have the official one-child policy, but there was still an enormous amount of infanticide against girls and a lot of abandonment. So these Marinols were going to go to China, particularly the women, when they finally convinced anyone to let them go, by the way. First, they were the secretaries for the men, but that's another story. And they're still mad about it. But they were supposed to go. This is what missionaries did. They went and they baptized pagan babies. They won souls for Christ. Well, if you've ever spoken to a missionary today, they don't talk that way anymore. They're not baptizing pagan babies. They're not winning souls for Christ. They're accompanying the poor. They're living with the people. So this is a very different articulation of transnationalism than the Society of Jesus. The Society of Jesus is a transnational band. The Marinol missioners are a group of US citizens who go and live with people in other countries for the purposes of associating, identifying themselves with those people in order to bring a more just world.